Hey there, this is Dan and you're watching The Salty Sea. And I'm really excited to make a basically emergency video to talk about two new Warcry developer positions that just opened up at Games Workshop. I'm incredibly excited that they are taking the game seriously enough and supporting it hard enough to be actually um, hiring two new people specifically just to work on Warhammer Warcry and also Underworlds. So let's take a look. So the two jobs that are out here are one for product developer for Warcry and Warhammer Underworlds, and the other for games developer, again for both games. So just want to sort of square away what the two do, what the difference is between the two. There are people who could speak to this with more expert level guidance than I could, but I've got at least a solid handle on it. So the product developer wears a ton of hats, but they essentially conceive and plan new product launches. So something like with Catacombs, deciding what is the goals for that set, what it's going to look like, all of that. That would have been the product developer's job. So they're um, responsible for the look and feel of the game. They're responsible for deciding who it's targeting, it's stuff like that. They do have some rules involvement, right? Because let's say they're sort of targeting a certain type of game that's supposed to be played, you know, they're going to be involved in the rules a little bit just to make sure that it's going towards what their vision is. But then the games developer, which they're also hiring for, is going to be the main rule writer. However, that's different from designer, right? So designer decides sort of the overall game mechanics, the way flavor turns into mechanics, things like that in the game. They're going to talk about the designer is going to be creating sort of the main quote unquote gameplay loop, right? Like what does a turn look like? What are you doing for your main actions, things like that. But the games developer is going to be making sure that the actual rules, the lawyer part of the game is airtight, right? Everything is clear. The corner cases are all, locked up. And then, in a really exciting turn, they're also responsible for game balance, right? Because part of finalizing these rules are just making sure that the game handles itself under stress, which is going to be people playing it both competitively and casually. Both are equally important, and actually making it work under both situations is going to be the job of the game developer. So I'm really excited about this, especially the game developer, who is really the person who deals with the stuff that, you know, fans of the game complain about when they play and when they notice like, oh, this faction is terrible, it has no options, versus oh, this faction is completely overpowered. Uh, it's the game developer who's really in charge of that, right? Game designers, they're there to make sure that the game is fun at its core. Um, and I think that Warcry is actually one of the best designed games that Games Workshop has ever produced. That's why I mainly talk about it on this channel. But the game developer is going to have a bunch of challenges, and I think that's really cool. So I just wanted to talk about them a little bit. The first one is going to be maintaining separate identities for Warcry and Underworlds. Now, they do this pretty well right now in that just Underworlds being hex-based, having a lot more depth with the cards, and Warcry just being sort of this big skirmish, well, not big compared to AOS, but sort of a bigger sort of skirmish, um, sort of a more casual game. Right now is sort of the identity mixtures, but one of the issues with that is that um, Underworlds, being the easiest game to get into, is really attractive from a casual setting. And then also Warcry, people are talking about having Warcry tournaments. That's one of the ways that you engage with the overall community with any game like that. And so Warcry does need to hold up under tournament play. So it's not enough to just say one is casual and one is competitive. They need to have separate identities while also each game containing both the competitive and casual coin. So I want to talk about specifically game issues with Warcry that I think that the next game developer is going to need to be tackling. And I think they're really exciting. So the first is the toughness problem, right? So anyone who's played Warcry a lot will tell you high toughness models are generally overpointed. Um, and there are sort of good and bad reasons for why that's there. Next, we've got movement and round length. And don't worry, I'm going to go into a few of these in specific soon. So the next is movement and round length. Movement is incredibly important in Warcry. And then the base game shipped with 3 round games, and then Catacombs came in with 5 round games. And it is cool that they're experimenting with that, and I think the developer is going to be the one who needs to decide what that is. Um, then there's simplicity versus depth with Warcry. So part of what makes Warcry such a good game is how quick it is for teaching people how to play, how much fun and how easy the setup is, right? And depth can be important for keeping people in the game, but also can hurt that a little bit. Then they also mentioned in their job description setting up playtest teams, which I think is really exciting because the what goes on in say the 40K playtest teams, or even to a lesser extent the Age of Sigmar playtest teams, is kind of legendary and sort of this mythic thing of people wondering. So that would be really exciting to see with Warcry. Honestly, I would literally chop off a finger to be part of that playtest team. Um, then I also find that the linear pointing algorithm is one of the issues with Warcry, and I'll explain that later, but it's one of the reasons why only the very cheapest and the sort of um, big beefy models are really valuable in this game, and why a lot of the middle models really struggle. Now, I play Underworlds a lot less. I did buy the opening starter set, so I have played quite a few games, but fewer of them recently. So I'll go into a little less detail with these, but um, release schedule and rotation is going to be something that the developers, product, and game work on. And then also balancing the sort of hyper-competitive game mechanics of Underworlds with the sort of bespoke sort of painting project models that come with the game, I think is at the core of what's difficult about Underworlds. So let's get really into the toughness problem, right? So everyone, that you'll talk to who's played a bunch of Warcry will tell you that they've noticed toughness is overpointed. It is the most commented on thing in the game, is all these high toughness models are bad, almost uniformly. The struggles of Nurgle mortals and iron golems are sort of a meme at this point. But there is a reason for this, right? Warcry was designed to be a fast-moving, brutal game, which is going to be more fun for people just picking it up, wanting to see some action, wanting to see some fighting, right? So making the um, making the tough, durable models not be the best thing you can be doing, I think was really important for Warcry's early success, right? Um, if you had made Nurgle Mortals, just this immovable wall of beef right away in the game, and that was the only powerful thing you could do, I think the game would have been much less successful. So I get why they made this mistake, right? This is by far the lesser of two evils. But it's still better to um, do it correctly, right? Or to do it in a balanced way. Because the problem is, the tough factions, they kind of feel completely unplayable, right? Stormcast without Ether Wings is essentially unplayable in the game, and even Gryph-hounds, they help, but not nearly enough in my opinion. And then obviously the issues with Nurgle and Iron Golems, all of the tough factions, any of the sort of armored things from Slaves to Darkness have this problem. And it sort of tells certain players that the game doesn't like them, right? So if your thing is Nurgle, or let's say your thing is Stormcast, and you just love this faction and you want to play them in every version of the game, Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Underworlds, Warcry, and then Warcry just says, oh, actually, we wanted it to be fast-paced and brutal, so Nurgle's just not in the game. Like, yes, you can have rules, but you can't succeed if you play them. We're essentially going to balance them out of the game because that's not what we want the game to be about. That's really insulting for players, and it will make players sort of turn away. Um, so you do need to make it so that, sure, maybe the game's not about these sort of wall of beef defensive armies, but you still need to make it an option for people who want to play that way, right? The more options and the more ways to play there are for a game, the more there is just kind of sticking power that the game is going to have. So right now, right, with toughness, there's no rock, paper, scissors for what high toughness models are good against. For example, Strength 3 does more damage to Toughness 5 than it does to Toughness 4, point for point, because it does the same amount of damage to Toughness 5 as it does to Toughness 4, except that the Toughness 5 model paid a bunch of points for Toughness 5 in its points cost. So it's actually taking more damage point for point from Strength 3 than the Toughness 4 model did. And then the same is true with Strength 5, right, which it does less damage to Toughness 3 than it does to Toughness 4, point for point. Now, this could be an interesting rock, paper, scissors, right? If it's basically like the 3s beat the 5s, the 5s beat the 4s beat the 3s, but then it goes around and round. The issue is that the 4s don't really struggle against the 5s, and the 3s don't really struggle against the 4s point for point because toughness is overpointed. So there's no rock, paper, scissors there. And in the meta right now, you'll see strength 3 and toughness 3 models are just more powerful. And then the potentially most powerful chaff unit in the game, or actually just the unit straight up, is the blowpipe skink. And it's all because it's got that 2 there in the toughness box. And then, those supposedly weak, low strength blowpipes actually just doing way more damage than they should be. The other part of that is that most damage output is crit based, right? There's no strength 4, damage 3, crit 4 damage unit, right? And so a unit like that would make toughness really matter for your opponents because all of a sudden those hits that aren't crits, getting more of them would actually be most of the damage that you're creating. However, that doesn't exist at the moment, and that's okay, right? I get why they did that because crits should be exciting. Um, that's part of what sort of the selling point of Warcry is. In any given dice roll, anything could happen. A crit could just blow your opponent out of the water in a place where you thought you had no chance. That was incredibly effective for getting the game off the ground, I think, but that feeling has limited replayability. It can be kind of frustrating going into something, just knowing, okay, I'm fishing for crits here, I'm fishing for crits, what's going to happen? Where the crits feel old to you, and now you're at the point where the strategy is what's interesting to you. So they do need to do, I think, not a better job, because like I said, the job that they did is why Warcry has turned out to be so great, but I think that they need to really attack this problem, figuring out what to do about the way that toughness just doesn't matter in the game, and how anyone playing competitively would wish they could have toughness 0 if they could have it. The next one is movement and round length. Now, 10-inch flyers are sort of one of the amazing things to have in this game, but then you look at, say, flying on a 5-inch move model is almost a detriment compared to how many points you pay for that flying keyword. The other thing is that 5-inch move chaff models, so let's say the Demonet, right, or the Corvus Cabal Spear Guy and the Daughters of Cain Sister of Slaughter, who have the exact same Warcry card. Models like that run Warcry, right? The Blood Reaver is amazing in the game. The thing that makes Skaven and Seraphon probably the 2 scariest warbands in the game is because their chaff moves 6 inches, and so that's just better than the 5-inch chaff. And then Stormcast Vanguard, they're really close behind because they have the 10-inch flying chaff, right? Aether Wings are incredible units. And it's all because cheap fast-moving models really dominate the game. Catacombs did a really good job of lessening the issue slightly by just adding 5 rounds of time in the game, which was enough for some of the slower warbands to sort of catch up. And I think that that's really good. It doesn't fully fix the issue, um, and there are issues with, say, 5 rounds. Sometimes the game is decided by round 2, and but you can't really succeed because you still have that outside, or sorry, you can't concede because you still have that outside, say, 10% chance at victory if you just hold on. So then you're sort of this walking zombie player for sometimes 3 whole rounds in Catacombs. So that can be a bit of a disadvantage. So I do think that future developers are going to need to work on, is it the length of the game that we need to fix to make it so that, some of the slower warbands can still compete? For example, Fire Slayers are desperate for help there. Um, or is it, something else, some other mechanic that, you need to work with the designers to figure out how to make some of the slower warbands still feel viable in the game. Um, and then so figuring out all of these fixes, I think, comes into the sort of next crux, which is partly a design issue, but development needs to be sensitive of it as well, which is simplicity versus depth, right? So simplicity is sort of just how beautiful the central core of the game is right away, easy to learn, easy to have fun with. But then having things to build around and keep us interested often requires just having more to dig into after you've gotten into that first step. Um, and then those two are really opposed to each other. And so one of the issues with the balance problems that I just talked about was that they bring more complexity into the game. So for example, one of the things that people have talked about to fix the toughness problem is 40k's penalty for having half the strength of the toughness of the thing you're attacking, right? Then you get an extra penalty. There are also ways to have like after saves to make certain things more durable. But the issue with those is that they add complexity to the game, and part of what makes Warcry so amazing is how just quick it is to play, how fast-paced it is. So some of these are design's job, but a developer can help with this, and I think that the big sort of holy grail of the future of Warcry is going to be figuring out ways to fix those balance issues without making the game get bogged down. I think the worst thing that could happen to Warcry would be a ton of bloat. Something that, the big games, 40k and Age of Sigmar, you do hear people complain about that a lot, but not for long, right? At the end of the day, 40k players, Age of Sigmar players, they're generally happy if you add more depth to the game, even if you force them to buy more books. They will complain about it, but they will buy those books and they will play the game more because you did it. I don't think the same is true of the average Warcry fan, right? I think a lot of us love Warcry because it's more accessible and easier to set up and easier to play a bunch of games in the same time it would take to play an Age of Sigmar game, right? You can play, um, 2, sometimes 3 if you get moving quickly, games in the time it takes to play one AOS game. That's what I love about Warcry. So it's really important to fix those balance issues that would stop someone from sort of diving in the game for a long time, say 5, 10 years of playing Warcry, but to fix them without bloating the game up. Now, one of the big ways to do that is just through points. And one of my gripes with the game has been that the algorithm that they seem to use, and there are some really great people in the Discord for Warcry who have figured out within 5 points of error what the algorithm is exactly for any given sort of points to Warcry stats. And one of the concerning things is it's essentially linear, right? So let's give some examples, right? The fly keyword matters more on a move 10 model than it does on a move 4 one. So let's talk about, let's say you could have a model that was move 1. Give it fly. That fly doesn't really matter much. The only time it's ever going to matter is when you actually creep up to the base of a tower and then you just get to creep to the top of the tower. In terms of the actual ability to move around the board, it doesn't really matter. Um, the same is true for a movement 25 model, right? Flying would mean nothing there because it would still have plenty of movement to get around any obstacle. But once you're going in between, right, I would say flying probably matters the most on, say, a movement 8 model. Um, I play a lot of Corn Demons and I play a lot of Gloomspike Gits. The Boingrot Bounder boss feels significantly more mobile than the Gorehound or the Fleshhound. Gorehounds and Fleshhounds still feel very mobile, much more so than, say, something with the mount keyword would, but you really do notice the flying Boingrot Bounders. So the issue there is that it seems like they essentially pay about the same for flying, regardless of what it is, right? So it also, you really notice it with toughness again, to keep banging the toughness drum. Jumping from 5 to 6 is essentially irrelevant. It almost never matters in game, but you still pay a ton of points for that extra point of toughness, and so it makes these 6 toughness models, which I love putting 6 toughness on a model just for visually what it represents on the card, right? When you see that 6 toughness, and then you look at your model, which has a ton of armor, it tells you, listen, this model is just a big old slab of iron and beef, and cutting through it is going to be impossible for your opponents. But in game, it means nothing, right? So points-wise, it should also be very little of a drop. And then it can be this really cool design tool where you essentially just say that something is dangerous without having to make it more or less powerful. But they haven't done that here. So imagine the way Magic the Gathering will often put Death Touch on these really huge creatures where Death Touch never matters. They kill everything they touch anyway because they're so big, but it makes the creature look more impressive and hit you emotionally much harder without altering the game balance at all. That essentially should be what the jump from 5 to 6 toughness is, something that matters almost nothing for game balance, but that just emotionally hits you as being impressive. And that isn't available to them because they have this linear toughness pointing algorithm that doesn't give them the flexibility to do that. So another issue, sort of, this is with algorithm complexity, is every faction runs off of the same algorithm for points right now. Now, changing that up is really scary and dangerous and would require a real professional, a real, someone who actually really understands the game, really understands the math, to make multiple pointing algorithms that say a defensive leaning faction could do it this way, an offensive leaning faction could do it this way, and have those still be balanced against each other. But that's the job of a developer, right? That's what someone who works on the game 40 hours a week could actually get after doing if they are sort of mathematically minded. And I would really hope that whoever they hire is that way. And then one of the sort of side effects of some of the issues with their pointing algorithm is that mid-size units are completely useless in the game for the most part, right? Anything between about 130 points and 160 points, that's sort of the sweet spot of always being bad, but it's really like, 100-point units are almost always terrible. Yeah, that whole mid-range can really struggle. And part of that is because dice abilities are this incredible mechanic that they went with the game that really make your biggest models really important because the dice scale, right? Giving an extra attack scales the bigger that attack is. So Onslaught is best on your big beefers and you get more value from them that way. The same is true as Rampage, right? You are heavily incentivized to have at least one really impressive, powerful model in your warband so that you can give those Onslaught Rampage abilities to it to make these incredible, exciting moments. Then there's sort of the activations war, right? The more things you do in the game, the more likely you are to win. And so having a ton of little weedy chaff people, blood reavers, plains runners, ghouls. Uh, Having a ton of those is really powerful in the game. So it's often just um, two elites from each team wading through the chaff units of the other person. And I actually do find that fun because it's really impressive, right? When the big leaders are just like mowing down the chaff units of the other guy, and then finally maybe at round three they get to each other and they fight. Um, but I think a lot of people say fall in love with, you know, a lot of the bespoke Warcry warbands, which have a ton of 100 point to 180 point models in them. And then they play and they play, and then they find that a lot of those models are not very useful. And I think it really sucks to have large swaths of your model range not be useful in the game. And so that's going to be something that I think the developers are going to really need to work on, and something that having non-linear pointing algorithms will really help them with getting more sophisticated math into the game. I do plan to talk a little bit about evaluating units in the future for this game, um, but that'll be down the road after I've done my sort of list building videos. Finally, we get to Underworlds. Now, I've played a lot less of this, so I'm not going to go as in depth into the mechanics of it. Um, there is a lot of work to be done with balancing the different win conditions, but I think there's other people who can speak to that better. So I do want to just point out a few things that I've noticed sort of tracking the game. As I did buy the original starter set, planning on playing a ton of Underworlds. And the first issue is the release schedule and rotation, right? So as as you sort of release more and more things, power creep is, essentially inevitable and not necessarily even a bad thing. So I don't want to complain about that here. Um, but what it does do as you sort of release more things and each subsequent year you're adding things to the game and those things are more powerful, um, it makes it so that people have to really keep up. Okay, and that's a good thing, right? That helps you sell models, but it then sort of puts them on a treadmill, and it requires your players to, stick with you. And one of the things that, say, Magic the Gathering, which has sort of their standard format, which is only things from the last 2 years, one of the things that they fall back on to keep people interested is they say, listen, we're going to release new sets. To play the most exciting format, you have to buy these sets. But once your cards rotate, once your models rotate, we're still going to give you a bunch of ways to play those things, right? So then there's all these casual formats. There's also sort of eternal formats that don't rotate. So I think that future developers for Underworlds are really going to need to think about what are the formats for Underworlds, how are they doing it, um, do they demand that players who want to compete buy every warband, right? Or do they want to make it easier to buy singles? Um, because I think that part of their release schedule is that if you really want to compete, collecting every single warband to stay competitive is really, really difficult. Um, so they need to decide sort of, do they want to be the ultimate competitive miniatures game and say that only the most spiky of players are allowed to play this game, by having you sort of have to run on such an intense treadmill to keep up? Or do they want to offer sort of casual and competitive options for Underworlds? Part of what sort of first drew me to the game um, was the fact that it was easier to get into, right? You just buy this little package of miniatures, and then you just have a few things to paint, which kind of leads to one of the tensions. It's not a drawback at all. It is a strength of the game, but it's a tension with what the game's doing, where it's this ultimate competitive game. The mechanics are incredibly spiky, are incredibly sort of mentally involved to build your deck and think about the spatial component of the game, the geometry of the game. Um, and yet, whenever I hear people talking about Underworlds, it's generally the people excited about it tend to be pro painters, not sort of uber gamers. It seems like the crowd of cutthroat sort of pro players are generally more into sort of things like Magic or Dota or League of Legends than they are into or say like CS:GO, than they are into Underworlds at the moment, and that's okay, right? But I do think future developers are going to need to decide, you know, how cutthroat is Underworlds going to be as a game mechanics game versus sort of the way they market it, which is look how incredible these sort of bespoke luxury sculpted warbands are. Um, or is that just something they're going to decide as a strength that, you know, 75% of the people buying Underworld's warbands aren't buying them to play with them, and maybe that's okay. Um, that's going to be a really interesting challenge for whoever takes this job. Finally, I devoted almost all of this video to what the game developers are going to do, but I do just want to talk about some of the product developer challenges, which are also really exciting, and I think whoever goes up for that job should be thinking about these things. I honestly think that the first edition of Warcry was basically perfect, right? They had a real problem with Age of Sigmar with developing this world that they said, okay, Chaos won. It started with Chaos winning, and now Sigmar's coming in. He's trying to do his best. Um, but we're not actually going to tell you anything about the world or who lives there, right? So then Warcry comes in and it says, well, we told you Chaos won, but then we only gave you cities of Sigmar and a whole bunch of Order armies. So what are most of the people doing? Well, most of the people are in this crazy Mad Max Thunderdome situation where they all cosplay in these crazy sort of abstract chaos concepts. And here are the abstract chaos concepts. And this is what the world of Age of Sigmar, what 90% of the world is actually doing. And it was incredible. And I think as product development, as sort of concepting what it needs to be about, they did an incredible job. Um, I also think that lately they've done a really good job with Beastgrave and Dire Chasm for Underworlds, right? Putting them in specific places to tell very specific stories. They are going to need to answer a lot of questions about the future of those games, though. So one would be sort of who is the audience? Are these just, is Warcry just the intro pack to Age of Sigmar, like say the Grand Alliance books kind of implied, or is it its own game? A lot of people, sort of 40K type people, complained about the Kill Team Pariah Nexus box and how poor the value was there and sort of who is this even for. It'd be really important to sort of avoid that problem for future box sets, right? So are we going to roll future box sets in whatever is happening with Age of Sigmar? I mean, I imagine that's what the next Warcry box set will be. It'll have to do with whatever this sort of Destruction versus Stormcast AOS 3.0 release ends up being like. But for whatever the future, you know, the fourth Warcry box set, I think there's a lot of interesting sort of questions to ask there about how they can make that more effective. Then there's also the thing about Warcry starter boxes, right? So the Ironjaws and Gits boxes sold out pretty quickly and were basically only purchased by AOS players who were just using them as the most cost-effective way to build an army. And I do think product developers for Warcry are going to need to decide, is that actually really desirable, right? Is the purpose of Warcry to get you into Age of Sigmar? Or do they want to be selling boxes that are specifically for Warcry players? Then finally, sort of the far future of Warcry. Is it going to stay in the Varanspire or expand to the larger world? I think that's a really interesting decision that product developers are going to have to decide, right? Is it just chaos plus the K-Knight Shadowstalkers, who honestly feel pretty chaosy even though they're order? Or is there more to explore, right? Do we, in the next one, do we just pick up the whole game and just move it somewhere? Do we say, hey, listen, Archeon told all of his Warcry people, hey, go invade the Realm of Beasts for me. And then all of a sudden, the next Warcry is all in the Realm of Beasts, and you know the Iron Golems are running into the Realm of Beasts, and they're running into a new, a new bespoke warband that you've created to be in there, right? So thinking about what's next to explore is going to be something for this product developer, which is kind of cool, right? Because Warcry Catacombs Did some really cool stuff setting up Broken Realms Morathi, as far as sort of why are people in the catacombs, what is there to find in the catacombs. Oh, look, Morathi uh, got a ton of value from her Canine Shadowstalkers showing up there, and that helped her kick off her entire bid to become a god, which, you know, sort of set the whole realms on fire and now is everything we're doing in the story. All that came from Catacombs in what I think was really well done product development. And so it's going to be interesting what they do having someone full time in that role. Um, the same with how Underworld's Beastgrave kind of set up Broken Realms Kragnos. So again, someone who's full time in this role is going to get to decide, are we mostly just working on only doing intro packs to the AOS story, or are these telling their own stories just in the same universe? Or can we do both, right? That's going to be a really interesting set of challenges for the next product developer for Warcry and Underworlds. So there you have it, all of my sort of excited ramblings about the new positions. Um, I'm really excited to see who applies. If you are thinking of applying for one of these, please shout out at me in the comments. I would love to know sort of your takes on some of these challenges, what you're excited about with attacking this. If this were only the Warcry developer, I would absolutely be applying because it just sounds so fun. Underworlds is a bit of a maze to me, so I wouldn't be, but it's really cool. If you're as excited as I am about this, you know, please do leave a like, or if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Uh, I'm just really excited about the future of Warcry today. I am going to be returning to my series on creating 3 lists for every warband, and I'll be doing Death really soon, just in the next few days. Thanks a bunch, and until that video, may all your rolls be crits.